Hi, I'm Keanu, and this is my audience. Oh, she did it. And for my call to action speech, I'm going to be talking about the Second Amendment. The main points in this call to action speech that I'm going to hit are the origins and the beginnings of the Second Amendment. Just talking about the Founding Fathers' creation and their ideas. Also, we're going to be talking about how this Second Amendment applies today. And by that, I mean the relevancy of it being in 2017. And then the last point that I'm going to highlight on is a life without the Second Amendment and what exactly that means in our day and age. So where it all began, the exact type of definition came from an event called the Boston Massacre. This occurred in 1770. And basically this was where British soldiers were being housed in the quarters of citizens' homes, and they were actually protecting British Parliament members. In this incident, the soldiers were actually being mocked and stones were being thrown at them and a bunch of other things. And so they fired blindly into the crowd, actually killing 3 people on the spot and then 2 others later. And what this ended up doing was becoming a sort of light bulb for a lot of the citizens that became U.S. citizens when the country formed, was just the idea that too much power, too much authority, especially with the idea of guns for the government and not the citizens, at that time could lead to a rule that was just authoritative. So there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson right here. This was not the actual Constitution, but it was the Constitution of Virginia, which was drafted in 1776. And it reads that no free man shall be debarred the use of arms within his own lands or tenements. And then there's actually another good one by Richard Henry Lee, who's an American statesman for the Second Continental Congress. And his was, to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms. These 2 quotes really show that from the Boston Massacre, the way that you can see only 6 years after that incident, that it was really strategic and really important that the Founding Fathers integrate that into all of the legislation after that. So this is where the Second Amendment was really exercised, and it starts at the Revolutionary War. This is where the wording in the Second Amendment, the militia, was actually formed, and as I said, exercising the rights to defend themselves against the tyranny of British Army. It's a really important event that really set the basis for a lot of what we know as the Second Amendment. In James Madison's 46th in the Federalist Paper, it says that Americans have the right and the advantage of being armed, unlike other citizens of other countries, which is a really big and important point because not a lot of countries, they have a lot of strict gun rules and they don't have the freedom, and it is not seen as a right. And as of this moment for the Revolutionary War, this is where it began to be seen as a right. So gun control is like a really big thing that's going on as far as the Second Amendment being controversial. Gun control is technically defined as any action taken by the federal government, a state or a local, through the legislation, the sale, or the purchase of handguns and other types of firearms. So as we've mentioned previously, there's been a lot of incidents going on as far as gun control, gun legislation, background checks, and so on and so forth. And so gun control isn't in itself a bad idea. It's not bad to understand that guns need to be treated properly. It needs to be a safety thing. But at the same time, understanding that that should not conflict with the idea that it should be a right. The laws, this was a really good quote that was from 7 News actually, and it just says that criminals by definition do not obey laws. So how do more gun laws affect criminals? And to me that quote stood out because it just points to the fact that if you're a law-abiding citizen and you understand that it's your constitutional right, you have no problem with guns or anything alike. It's the criminals who don't appreciate the legislation, who don't appreciate the guns, that are going to disobey the laws. So actually adding more laws to this type of ordeal doesn't really affect anything in one way or another. So concealed carry. Concealed carry is a form of having a gun on you in public places as long as it is concealed. There's a couple pros and a couple cons. I do think the pros outweigh the cons. Some of the cons being that non-carrying citizens might feel threatened. I can understand the way you might think of this because it could be a concern to public safety, but if you just kind of flip that coin and you think of the other side, if you're a law-abiding citizen, you should have nothing to fear, because chances are the person that was able to get that gun went through the necessary background checks or security precautions to get that gun. And not to mention that there's a sort of sense of self-defense when you're talking about safety for your family or just as an individual. It's a really big thing. Robbers and, like we said, criminals don't really care about the law, so they don't really care what kind of gun control measures are out there. A gun will do all the talking for you, quite frankly. So this was the Don't Wait Till It's Too Late. There's a bunch of different types of events that have gone on, especially most recently. The one that was most famous for us here at home is the Aurora Theater shooting. Of course, Sandy Hook Elementary, and then one of the bigger ones in the San Bernardino attack. These could have all been measures that had, teachers been armed or people in the workplace been armed without it being so controversial. It could be something that could have been prevented, and maybe not prevented, but it could have saved extra lives in that case. And if you can say that it's saving extra lives, then I think that's worth it. And just a couple highlights in the Aurora Theater shooting. It was just one gunman. 12 people were actually killed, 70 people were injured, but as we all know, many more families were affected by the entire event as a whole. So for my call to action, I really am advocating for you to understand the importance of your right for the Second Amendment. Great Britain has actually had a gun ban since 1997, and the number of recorded violent attacks rose by 77% since then. And so if you want to compare with the sister country, Great Britain, there are actually 2,100 violent crimes per 100,000 people, while in the US there's actually 500 violent crimes per 100,000 people. And that just shows that maybe perhaps gun control and gun measures like that aren't as effective as you might think, whether that's what you're thinking. So the last thing to understand is that it is your right to bear arms and to take them up and to understand that and exercise that, and that is my call to action.